So again, that's where their values and preferences come in. We're all wearing different clothes today, aren't we? Different colours. That's a preference that we've expressed. It would be boring if we all chose the same clothes, wouldn't it?
Although Jamie does wear that shirt every time.
It's not the same shirt.
That is so true.
It's Steve Jobs, isn't it? I take that decision out of the day. I have 12 of these shirts.
I think about this, and I think, in a way, NICE is, damned if it does and damned if it doesn't, doesn't it? It is presenting that expert specialist decision with the evidence, and then that allows you, doesn't it, Steve, as a generalist, to apply that in the context of your practice. So I think that's what NICE needs to do. I think if NICE tried to sort of balance everything, it wouldn't publish anything. There's been a really interesting conversation around the pain guidance, hasn't there, as a case in point. And that's really, really polarised people. But I read it, and at the end of the day, it presented the information, it presented some specialist information, it presented what evidence we've got. And as I read it, the decision is still there with the practitioners. It's not saying if you don't follow this guidance, you're going to get told off. It's presenting all of the information, guiding you towards what they think is the recommended choice, but it's still the choice of the prescriber. And I think that's what it does. We take it for granted now. But we never used to have that.
Am I still allowed to, Bran? Can I do benefits, risks, alternatives, and do nothing? Is that still a thing?
Yeah, that's what I just said about the option talk. That's exactly it. So it comes from the NCT, the National Childbirth Trust, way of achieving consent. But I really like that as well.
I've got a quiz for you, Jonathan. When was NICE created?
Well, given that we've just celebrated our 20th anniversary in 2020, is that close? 2000? Frank Dobson?
1999, so it's close enough. The reason I asked, what was its first piece of guidance?
Wisdom Tooth?
Pick me.
Was it Zanamivir?
Yes, I think it was.
Oh, Zanamivir,
yes.
That's it. Yeah, it links to what we were just saying, because it was the first piece of guidance. It was obviously this new drug for flu. And if I remember rightly, the pharmaceutical industry went nuts because
Yes.
you or
Said
NICE
no.
didn't really go for it. How things have changed.
He wasn't in NICE at the time.
No, I wasn't. We came into NICE from the National Prescribing Centre shortly after that, but I remember it very well. It's an interesting one, because I think philosophically as well, if NICE wasn't around, I think we would need to invent it. I think it's very nice for the government to have, and it's not about blaming someone, but having this organisation that's fiercely independent and has methods and processes that are some of the best in the world, that you can say, these guys have made this impartial decision, we've taken politics and emotion out of it, and we've done an assessment of the evidence that says this is where its place in therapy is, alongside the patient's expertise, the patient's preferences, and indeed the clinical expertise of the healthcare practitioner.
And that's why I've always been a fan of NICE, because I was a sort of prescribing advisor in the years just before NICE came along. We had our problems, but NICE in general made life a lot easier and made those decisions much more consistent across different areas.
Gimmo's forgotten protocol, isn't he, STC? He's not even putting his hand up to speak.
Sorry.
I was going to say, look, while we're at it, let's just finish off the strategy, because we're so deep into NICE. So, I know what these documents are like. I know you've got to speak to so many people, and you've got to get it out there, and it's got to be a strategy. You've got to have a mission statement. Can I just say one thing, Jonathan, about it? And I'm not saying you're responsible for it, but here's one thing, not to you then, to everybody and the listener. For all the things that we've talked about on this podcast around multimorbidity, and it does not feature. And for me, that is one of the key things of the next 5 years. And NICE has said it, but I'm not seeing it. How is it going to adjust its guidance so that it is not disease specific and it is more for people with multimorbidity?
So I don't think you're going to get any change in the way that guidelines are produced on a sort of a single disease basis, because that's where the evidence is. Rather, I think it's more important that the clinicians use the guidance to then apply to the individual with 4 different comorbidities and take that into account. I don't think you're ever going to get sophisticated enough data and evidence to be able to say, there's a 75-year-old lady with type 2 diabetes, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, high blood pressure and osteoporosis. What does the evidence say about how I should manage her heart failure? Because those people aren't in the clinical studies, Steve, and never will be. You couldn't include them ethically. And until we have really powerful real-world data with modelling to be able to do that, then you're never ever going to get guidelines that do that. I think what we are going to be aiming to do within the strategy is to make our guidance easier for people to find. Because I think it's one of the big criticisms that we have about, and I have about, the NICE website. You almost have to know what you're looking for and where to find it, to be able to find it. One of the big things about the strategy is about making the guidance not only useful but usable and used as well, so we can measure whether it's being used.
I hear what you're saying about real world data, but I just think there's a risk that if we don't come to terms with how we present that, it's going to begin to lack some relevance and credibility. That's a personal opinion.
Yeah, and I do agree with that. And I would actually take this back to some of the fundamentals around shared decision making here as well, because I think what this lends itself to, and yet then there isn't any escaping it, you need to have a conversation with the person that you're seeing in your clinic to find out what it is that's most important to them. And that is a skill that I don't think too many healthcare professionals have. And it's a skill that people need to really, really work on. And there's lots of things you can think about. I mean, can I ask you guys a question? So if you're having a conversation with a patient, right? And you ask the question, how can I help? Okay, how long do you think, on average, it would take before the healthcare professional would interrupt the patient after asking that question?
Is this based on research?
Yes.
Ooh, probably like 3 seconds.
It's 10 seconds that they would interrupt, and it can be as short as 3 seconds. And if you think about when you're having conversations and consultation skills, again, going back to what David Haslam said, the 4 things that he said about consultation skills, what that healthcare practitioners need is to shut up and listen, because if you don't shut up, you can't listen. You need to care and show empathy. I can see Gimmo getting upset already because I heard one of the original podcasts about compassion and empathy, but caring is really important. And you need to know something. You don't need to know everything, but you need to know something that's going to help people. Just as a follow-up to that, then if people are left to speak freely, how long do you think people talk for before they shut up?
30 seconds?
Yeah, it's about 30 seconds before people shut up. And people think...
5 minutes.
Yes. Well, and I think that's part of the problem. I think some of the defence around why we don't do that, why we don't ask open questions in consultations is because I'd never get my consultation finished because people would ramble on for 10 minutes. Actually, no, people will talk for about 30 seconds. And then if you don't ask open questions, how can you find things out about what's important to people?
Well, you can prescribe then, can't you, to finish the...
There's my door.
Yes.
I mean, that is really fascinating, and I think, I know when I talk to a lot of GPs and they talk about shared decision making, I know what you're referring to there, isn't it? The spectre of the 9-minute consultation just comes up time and time again. That's what we've got to do, isn't it? We've got to convince people that shared decision making sort of process is possible within that shorter amount of time. Actually, it's beneficial because it probably saves time, effort, and money in the long run because you get a better outcome. We need to be realistic. You have got 9 minutes if you're lucky, and it's possibly on Zoom now, so we have to incorporate that shared decision framework in that environment as well. But it is doable because I've seen it done.
And it's an invest to save. And going back to the original podcast, Jamie, about failure demand and value demand, this is a classic example. And it's this fear that if I spend a lot of time now, that it's going to cost me in time. But that's a misconception in my view. And it's time well spent, so that you're then not having to fish back and have failure demand 6 months, 12 months, 2 years down the line when actually at the beginning. And I know that's difficult for people to see, but I see it clear as day.
The other interesting one, again, from NICE, evidence-based, all the rest of it, the Cochrane review on the use of patient decision aids in consultations showed that there was hardly any difference in the length of consultation when patient decision aids were used. The skill required to be able to have those conversations and use the patient decision aids in the consultation requires a bit of effort from the healthcare practitioner. But once you've done that, once you've got your spiel practiced and you know what you're going to say, you've got your, if you like, your checklist in your head that you can then use to manage the conversation. It actually doesn't make any difference to consultation times. And as you say, a happy patient is less likely to reconsult in the future, and they're more likely to be happy if they've been part of that conversation and you've made a shared decision with them. The other thing that I think we're going to work hard at is integrated guidance. And DOACs is a great example. You might have 5 different technology appraisals on the DOACs and a guideline, but how do you fit them together as a clinician? So we need to get better at how we integrate that content and make it available for people.
This episode of The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by OneLessPill.com and Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching.
Okay, Jonathan, I think we have spoken a lot about NICE and lots of great stuff there about shared decision making. But obviously the reason that you were so desperate to be the first guest on Series 2 of the Oral Apothecary. Lay it on us. What are you going to give us as your desert island drug?
The medicine that I would choose would be torcetrapib. Now, boys, do you remember torcetrapib at all? Okay, so torcetrapib...
You're probably saying it wrong.
I might be. Do you want me to spell it for you and you tell me how to say it? Torcetrapib was an anti-lipid medicine that was developed in the 2000s. It was a CETP inhibitor. Clinical trial was done, 15,000 people that did this study in. There was a 72% increase in HDL cholesterol and a 25% decrease in LDL cholesterol, as well as a 10% decrease in triglycerides. So they're your disease-oriented outcomes for a medicine, and you think on the basis of that, what a fantastic drug, get nice to do an appraisal of this and let's get it out to people as quickly as we can. As part of the development of this medicine, the FDA made them do patient-oriented outcomes as well. And what they found was that there was an increase in the risk of death, non-fatal MI, stroke and hospitalisation, and indeed an increase in total all-cause mortality. The development of this medicine was stopped in 2007. I just think this is a really, really good example of why we need POOs, patient-oriented outcomes for medicines, rather than DOs, rather than disease-oriented outcomes. And there's lots of other examples on that as well, which I'm sure you know about as well. Like,
are we going to have to put explicit on the show notes now that he said poo?
So torcetrapib, POOs not DOs, please.
Okay.
Hey.
POOs not DOs. Yeah.
And that's never came up before, so...
Yeah, I'm not sure anybody else, but we love that because obviously you are talking about evidence and as you've just said. So we're not going to argue with that, are we, apothecaries?
No, fantastic choice.
We love that. What about then a career anthem? I'm looking forward to this because I know you're a bit of a musician yourself, aren't you?
Well, I wouldn't say I was a musician. I do sing in a band with some really, really good musicians. And you probably expect me to pick a Bruce Springsteen song because I am an absolute Bruce Springsteen obsessive. But I'm not. I'm going to pick the greatest song for me that's ever been written. I happen to share this with my favourite song with John Peel, the late John Peel, and it's Teenage Kicks by the Undertones. 2 minutes of 36 seconds of absolute pure joy. It's simple. It's one verse repeated twice with a catchy chorus. It's great guitar. It's got a vague meaning, which I think is great when you're thinking about life and that sort of thing. It's quite naive. It's just brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So Teenage Kicks, please, on the Spotify playlist, if that's okay.
It's a great song. I know John Peel always said it was his best song, and I love it, but I never quite got it as being the best song ever written. But I guess he knows more about music than I do, so you're in good company.
We all have different values and preferences.
I was about to say the same thing, and that's what happens when you come on here with your Desert Island Drug and your career anthem, because it's about a powerful memory, and we don't know what John Peel's memory of that was. It's a great song, I agree. We've got lots of great indie tracks on there. So I'm assuming this was when you were growing up, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it came out in 1979, so I would have been 11. I remember loving the Undertones. I was a bit of a kind of a new wave punk rocker at the time. The first time I ever heard it.
Did you buy the single?
I did. Sire Records. I think I've still got it somewhere in the garage.
So John and I have had this conversation that, because of the Bruce Springsteen, him being a super fan of the Boss. I've got two older brothers. One handed me Born to Run years and years ago, obviously when I was a youngster late in the 70s, and the other one, I think it was All Wrapped Up by the Undertones, was their that album is still in my mum and dad's house, I think.
Where did it all go wrong for you though, James, musically? I mean, you went on to Richard Clayderman.
I did indeed. If you played Richard Clayderman for me now, I'd be able to recite my A-levels and undergraduate studies.
My Bruce Springsteen story will make you sick. When I was at Glastonbury and Bruce Springsteen was there, I didn't really get him, so I went and watched the Wonder Stuff. I think it was, in a little tent.
I thought this was going to involve magic mushrooms.
I'm going now. See you, boys.
I didn't really get him.
That's two great picks. Now then, the more difficult one, but I think we all as apothecaries, and I know some of the Twitter listeners have found this really helpful actually, and have really enjoyed the book choices. So what would you like to give our esteemed listener to add to their book list as a choice?
This was probably more difficult than the record. Like Jamie, I'm quite an avid reader, so there's some fantastic books that I've read that have had a massive influence on the way that I think about decision making and stuff. So any Danny Kahneman books, Thinking Fast, any Atul Gawande stuff, fantastic.
Yeah, we've had those, yeah.
But yes, exactly. So I thought, you know what? Given that my great passion is around having meaningful conversations with people about medicine's choices or whatever else. How do you get to know people and what they're thinking, feeling? And the way to do that, I think, the art of writing a letter is gone. You don't do it on a text message anymore. You don't often do it on a telephone call. The way that you get to know what people are thinking is by reading autobiographies. So I've read loads and loads of autobiographies over the years.